Bore da, a croeso cynnes I chi gyd. Very good morning and a very warm welcome to you all this morning. It's a very crisp, cold February morning, but I think what we've got in store this morning will warm everybody's hearts by the end of the session. Today is the opportunity for us to launch the teaching and learning to a strategy to support vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. It's a programme that we've worked closely with Welsh Government, and we're very glad of their support, and it's the work on behalf of the regions and partners across Wales, and we're very grateful this morning that the author of the programme, Mike Gershon, will be joining us later. And we'll be starting off this morning with Owen Lloyd, the Director of Education for Welsh Government. And we are very grateful to have Owen with us this morning to say a few words and put the programme in context. So, croeso cynnes, Owen, very warm welcome to you and look forward to hearing from you. Diolch yn fawr.
Diolch yn fawr, Arwen. Bore da, yn gyntaf, diolch am y croeso. Good morning, thank you very much, Arwen. Thank you for the opportunity. It's also quite cold down in Cardiff here this morning, so hopefully it will warm up during the day. So thank you for the opportunity to say a few words this morning. This is an extremely important launch, and I'm grateful to the consortia for commissioning this bespoke professional learning support programme for the exclusive use of all schools and settings in Wales. Now, one of the Minister's key objectives is for a high quality teaching and leadership, where everyone is supported with the best professional learning so that they can support the success of all learners, but particularly those who are socio-economically disadvantaged. Addressing the needs of learners challenged by poverty is a key priority for the programme for government and the Minister for Education and Welsh Language. We know as a Welsh Government that schools and settings can't do everything on their own, but the Minister does see you, our education leaders and practitioners, as one of the biggest driving forces in our national mission to tackle the impact of poverty on attainment. Teaching, learning and assessment are the things that make a difference to our children and young people, especially for the progress of our most vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. And of course, our curriculum for Wales is central to our reforms and is a fantastic opportunity to meet the needs of vulnerable and disadvantaged learners by realising exciting and authentic experiences in school. Our new curriculum will have a strong role to play in addressing the gap in attainment and aspiration, and in creating a culture of aspiration and self-confidence. And the resource for professional learning being launched today will give teachers key insights into the things that matter and work when supporting this group of learners. And we encourage schools to engage with this resource, and I look forward to hearing more from Mike later in this session about the overview of this important programme, the benefits and the rationale. And I just want to finish by saying that we are committed to working with our PL partners to roll this out across Wales. Felly, diolch yn fawr Arwen, diolch am y cyfle, mae hwn yn lanshed pwysig dros ben, felly nôl at y ti. Thank you, Arwen.
Diolch o'r iawn, Owen, am y geiriau yna o gyd-destun. Thank you very much, Owen, for setting this important programme in the national context and getting a clear direction of where it sets within the policies of Welsh Government and the aspirations of the Minister for this very important group of people. I'm very pleased now to be able to introduce Dr. Kevin Palmer, and Dr. Kevin Palmer has worked very closely with us on this programme, and he is the person who is the lead on professional learning amongst other responsibilities in Welsh Government. So I'm very pleased this morning, Kev, to ask you to say a few words from your policy perspective and where this particular piece of work sits as a suite to support schools. Diolch.
Thanks, Edwin, and thanks, Owain, for the context as well. So I've just got about 10 minutes, and I want to try and with that 10 minutes, I want to try to give you a sense of exactly what Edwin just said, really, which is where this fits into our work in pedagogy, leadership, and professional learning, and where it fits more broadly at a level of detail, I guess, before Mike comes in. Where it fits into our aspirations to ensure the best possible set of learning experiences for all of our learners. And I'll start, it's in 5 bits, just a few minutes on each bit. And I'll start by saying, we've called this teaching and learning to support vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. We could have called it any number of things. It could have been called supporting all learners through evidence-based practice. It could have been a focus on something quite different. And I think it's important that the focus has fallen on this term vulnerable and disadvantaged learners for a couple of reasons. I just want to set out what I think those regions are when we're talking about our most challenged learners. And the first thing to say there is we're coming through, nearly through COVID, and as we reflect back on the world before COVID, well, you know, this education system wasn't a great place for those learners who are most challenged, particularly those most challenged by poverty. And it's something that as a government has been in focus for a long time, but in this particular government, that focus on learners challenged by poverty has become a really significant priority. Pre-COVID, that we were doing work in respect of these learners. During COVID, we know that these learners were the most adversely impacted of all of the learners in our communities. And as we now come post-COVID into a cost of living crisis, and whatever happens next, you know, after the cost of living crisis over the next few years, there's no sense in which it's likely that these young people will just kind of be lucky, take care of themselves, whatever you want to call it. The real overwhelming likelihood is that those most impoverished and disadvantaged in our communities will continue to suffer the highest impacts from disruption to school, from cost of living, and from those other challenges that our communities face. So why focused on the most challenged learners? It's obvious. Those are the learners who in the current environment need the greatest attention, support, and the most effective intervention and support when it comes to working in the classroom. So then you get the question, why create a resource bank? When Helen and the team came to me at the very beginning of this process, I was absolutely convinced, as you've just heard, by the case for focusing on this learning community, but I didn't need much convincing either that what our professional community needed was something that does 3 things really. The first is it puts all the expertise in one place. When Mike shows you through the resource later on, you'll see a fantastic array of expertise, real deep dives into significant and important areas of pedagogy and practice that are driven not just by evidence, which is important, but by a profound and insightful understanding of how that evidence applies to what we should say about practice. So this is a really expert piece of work. Secondly, as a resource bank, for want of a better phrase, it will give leaders and teachers and TAs, practitioners across the system 24/7 access to those resources. Now, I know not everybody works a 24/7 day, but it's great to have access to that stuff when you need it, whatever your working pattern, wherever you are in the country. You know, we talk about the National Professional Learning Entitlement. This hits that right on the nose in the sense that it makes these resources available on a 24/7 basis to anybody in the country in whatever language that they choose to work. And then finally, why create a resource bank? This gives us something to adapt and apply at school and cluster level. It is highly flexible, it's highly adaptable. The resources that you'll see in there, you'll be able to say, okay, right, I'm working in a small small rural school operating in the Welsh medium. I need to do this with some of my colleagues in order to get critical mass for the professional learning experience. Well, the access to this resource bank will enable you to do that smartly. It'll enable you to do it in a way that makes the most of the opportunities you get to undertake professional learning. So obviously a resource bank is an important resource in that sense. And then why focus on, my next question, I've got two left. My next question was why focus on the range of areas that are focused on in this resource. I'm not going to go through them and say why everyone is a good idea, though that would be tempting, but I think Mike's going to do that. But what I will say is there are 4 or 5 principles underpinning the selection of topics that have been pursued in this resource. And the first is there's an unequivocal evidence base underpinning each one of those areas. So again, I'm going to try and do this without mentioning the areas, but for every one that you're going to hear about today and with which you're going to engage over the coming months, the evidence base is well established, it's well presented in the resource itself, and it's something that you can engage with in the confidence that there's an evidence base behind its efficacy when it comes to application in practice. The second point for me is that it really is consistent with what we want to do with the new curriculum. So where we talk about creating independent learners who are ambitious and capable, able to make decisions for themselves. I nearly mentioned metacognition, then that would have broken my rule of don't mention the topics. You know, when you look at the resource topics and you think about what we want to do with the new curriculum and the kind of learners we want to make through the new curriculum, you'll see that every one of our learners, and this is my final point, on this item, every learner that you have in your classroom, not just those who are disadvantaged or affected by poverty or whatever other challenges, every other learner that you have, in your classroom will benefit from your professional understanding of the approaches and interventions that are articulated in the resource. And so finally then, what do we hope you'll do with it? As Helen, as Alwyn mentioned earlier on, when Helen came to us with this proposal, it wasn't free. It's required some investment from us. And so I think in the spirit of the professional learning entitlement, it would make sense for us to say, this is what we hope will happen with this resource because of the engagement of the regional consortia, LA partnerships and schools. We hope that you'll do at least the following 4 things. The first is that you'll fit it into your preparation for pedagogy for the new curriculum, into an understanding of what your staff need in respect of those groups who are in focus, those groups who need the most support. There's a lot of stuff in this resource, right? And you're going to need to think through carefully how you sequence it. I guess if I was in school wanting to implement this as PL, I'd want to give it a 2-year window to get the whole job done, and it deserves that window too, I would say. So you'll want to fit it into prep for the new curriculum. The second is you want to make sure that you use your inset time to focus on some of what's in that resource. This will give you a real quick win at inset time. You know, you know your school, you know what your learners need, you know which of the items in this resource will be of most use to you. Prioritize that at inset time, and you'll soon see the benefit of that, I'm sure. Third thing, obviously, apply it at classroom level. You know, look at what Mike is saying and what other people who are part of this resource are saying about what happens at classroom level. Nearly mentioned an intervention then, sorely tempted, but make that application, make it part of your school's development and thinking about how to tune your interventions and support and your provision, the school, the daily diet of school, to what this resource says is effective. And then finally, we'd love it for you if you would be able to share your experience and the impact of that experience amongst your own colleagues in school, in your local authority, in your cluster, with your region, in whatever way we can. The next stage in this work, once you're implementing it and making it all sing for you in school, is to share that experience and the impact of that experience with your colleagues. So it's an ask from us, as you'd always expect. This is great stuff, really well constructed. It makes a massive amount of sense. Get stuck into it, make it work in school, and share those experiences you and your learners have as a consequence. I wish you the very best of luck with it. Thanks very much.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Kevin, am y geiriau yna. Thank you very much, Kevin, for setting the professional learning context for this very important piece of work, and the challenge as you were setting it through right at the end there, you know, as we all hope that practitioners will see this, as we see it, as a very valuable resource in going forward, that people will be using it, sharing it, learning from it, but most of all capturing the impact of it on the learners that it's intended. But I'm sure what's people who will be using the resource, there are messages here for the range of learners that we are responsible for as well. So I think it gives me great pleasure now to introduce the author of this resource, a person that we as Regents have worked very closely with over a number of years, Mike Gershon. Mike, a former teacher himself, he's a published author and published over 40 books on teaching, learning and education. And what you'll see from the presentation is, as Kevin was describing there, from the evidence base and the purpose to make it the evidence then and the theory really then a practical resource that we can all use and understand in the classroom. And that's the key of many of his presentations with ourselves over the years. He's written over 90 guides on aspects of classroom practice, and his work has been translated to at least half a dozen languages, and it has been used in over 180 countries across the world. His resources have been viewed by over 4 million practitioners over the years. So Mike has a very not only a successful track record, but he's also seen by the profession as somebody that they can work closely with, identify with the language that he's using, and then turning that language then into really practical ideas in the classroom, which makes a significant benefit to the learners. Mike is also a parent, and we also enjoy catching up with his own journey into supporting his own youngster at home as well. So I'm sure everybody will enjoy Mike's presentation. So croeso cynnes, Mike, a very warm welcome to you, and look forward to you taking us through this incredibly valuable resource this morning. Croeso cynnes a diolch yn fawr. Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Many thanks there for the introduction, and thank you, of course, also to Owen and Kevin for their words this morning as well. I'm just going to share my screen with you, ladies and gents, this morning as I take you through the materials. First thing I'd like to do is just say a few further thank yous. This is the sort of culmination of quite a lengthy period working on this project and developing it. So first of all, thank you to the Minister himself for, and Welsh Government for commissioning the materials and providing the funding. And thank you to Owen, of course, as part of that, and to Kevin particularly, who's been a big advocate of this from the beginning. Thank you also to the MDs of all the consortia, who I know have been played a big role in terms of supporting this project and securing the funding, and then looking to work together to help make it happen. I'd also like to thank the PDG team, the Cross Consortia PDG team, who have been on board with this from the beginning and have been really supportive in pushing it forward. And of course, coming out of that, Helen Richards, who has played a pivotal role and has been incredible support for me and other members of the team who've been working on the project all the way through. And then finally to Sharon Williams as well, formerly of GWE, who was involved in the initial ideas and development of the proposal. And of course, thank you, ladies and gents, today for joining us for this session. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So as you heard there from Arwin, my name is Mike Gershon. If you haven't encountered me before, former teacher, but have been working as a trainer and consultant and author for many years now, focusing on the practicalities really of pedagogy in the classroom. So what I'd like to do in this session is take you through two distinct aspects of the project. First of all, we're going to look at the overview, and we're going to think about the rationale of the project, and I'm going to give you an insight into how it breaks down, what the materials cover, of course, how to access the materials as well. And then in the second half of the presentation, I want to dig into those materials in depth and really give you a sense of the range and the scope of the materials and how they might connect to your own settings, whether that's primary, secondary, English medium, Welsh medium, wherever it is that you're encountering the materials and looking to use them and to consider applying them to your context. There is a Q&A available throughout the presentation. If you do have any questions, please do use the Q&A button at the top of the screen. And if we have time at the end, I will address those questions, or as many as I can, at the end of the presentation. If we don't have time, I will address them after the event as well. So all questions that are posed, I will provide a response to those either live or subsequent to the event, and we'll email those out to you. So what does the project entail? You've already heard, sort of a certain degree of that, I think, in those initial words from Owain and from Kevin. The project is a suite of professional learning materials supporting vulnerable learners through effective teaching and learning. And of course, vulnerable and disadvantaged learners are encompassed within that description, within that title. And what you see on screen here is a series of 10 images, and each of these represents a different section of the material. So we have 10 sections that we've divided up the professional learning materials into, and each of those sections is a key area of pedagogy that we know works, that we know is an important intervention, that we know is going to have a really positive impact on learners, on achievement, and of course particularly on our vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. So in essence, what the project entails is a series of 10 core areas of pedagogy, and for each one a whole suite of practical, usable, flexible professional learning materials that are very much designed for schools to take off the shelf and to access either on a whole school level or with small groups, or for individuals as well. And one of the key things that you'll see as we go through the presentation this morning is that we've really tried to emphasize flexibility within the construction of the materials, and also how the materials are delivered electronically through the website on which they rest. And that was a very deliberate decision from the very beginning, because I recognize from having worked with hundreds upon hundreds of schools over the years, I'm sure you recognize yourselves from the various settings in which you work. I think if you're in school, you want that flexibility to be able to dip into the materials, find the elements that are most prescient for you, find the elements that connect most closely with your current priorities, with your development plans and so forth, and then be able to use them there and then. So one thing you'll find with all the materials is it's very much everything is available and open to use. You don't have to start at the beginning and work your way through. We don't have lots of dashboards, lots of clunkiness or anything like that. Everything is accessible from the moment you sign in, and everything is there ready for you to pick and choose from and identify, so it really marries up with the needs that you identify and that you know exist within your setting. So we have our 10 images there. You might be able to, through looking at those images, pick out some of those key areas of pedagogy on which we're focusing within the materials. Let me now just show you them in full. So we've got 10 key areas, and each of these areas has got a really strong evidence base behind it. And we also know, as we look there, each of those 10 areas fundamentally are indicative or a key part of what makes really effective teaching. Now, the first thing I'd say at this point is, I'm not suggesting, and we're not suggesting as we present the materials to you, that everything needs to be done at once, or everything here, must be sort of compressed into lessons or compressed into professional learning. Not at all. What we've got here is a whole range of different interventions for which we know there's evidence that they work effectively, that the evidence suggests these are some of the most efficacious things that we can be doing in the context of teaching and learning. Yes, to support all learners and to create really good outcomes for all learners, but very much to create those really strong outcomes for our disadvantaged and vulnerable learners. But what we're trying to do here is provide this wide range of materials so you can very much prioritize, pick and choose, select, work out what's going to fit best with your setting, with your needs. So each of these different sections, you'll see a couple of things to start off with. First of all, they're all color coded, and as we go through, that will become more and more evident within the PowerPoint presentation. Now, it's a small thing on one level, but it's actually a big thing on another level. When we were in the design phase of the materials, we wanted to make it really clear that all these materials connect together, but that each area is distinct. So when you visit the website, when you look at the materials, you've got this immediate color recognition, so you know what section of the materials you're in. And similarly, when you're sharing them with staff, we've got that immediate familiarity as well. But then we've got the coherence across the piece as a whole with the branding. You see there with the bespoke images that we've had made as well with the color. So there's this sense that these materials, they sit together, but then we've got these distinct strands within them. So the professional learning materials comprise two separate parts. Part one and part 2. And in the second half of the presentation, that's when I'm going to dig down into these in great detail. But initially, I want to provide you with an overview. So the part 1 section of the materials, for each of these 10 areas of teaching and learning, we've got 4 big picture videos. And in those videos, we're unpacking some of the key ideas that are absolutely central to these different areas. And in each of those, what I'm seeking to do with those videos is encourage colleagues, encourage yourselves to think critically, to reflect where you're currently at, where you're looking to go, what the impact is for learners, and particularly for your vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. And what we've got at the end of all those videos is a reflection question, which is intended to really stimulate that reflective mindset. And what I would say is across the materials as a whole, we've got lots of opportunities for reflection, because of course we all understand the absolute centrality of reflective practice to ensuring good outcomes, good teaching and learning, and that continuous development. And what we also wanted to ensure was that there's this interactive element running across the materials. So it's not just a case of consuming the materials, but it's very much interacting with them as well, or them being a stimulus for interactions with colleagues, whether that's at a senior leadership level, middle leadership, or with colleagues as a whole. So in the part 1, we also have a series of practical guides. So for each of these 10 areas, we've got a practical written guide that contains a variety of strategies, activities and techniques that teachers can use to implement these different areas of pedagogy within their classroom practice, or of course to develop and build on what they're already doing. See, I'm very consciously aware that of course these are things that are happening across the whole country in schools all up and down Wales, north, south, east and west. We're not saying this is all brand new, you should be doing it. Of course we're not. What we're saying is these are the areas we know that work. There's lots of good practice happening already. How can we build on that? How can we develop it? And can we also present some different strategies that teachers can use? So that is absolutely the emphasis. So part 1, 4 big picture videos, 1 written practical guide for each of these sections. Part 2, we then have a series of multi-part courses. So for each of these different areas of teaching and learning, we have 3 multi-part courses. So 30 courses in total. And those courses comprise a series of videos, screen record videos, drilling down in great detail different aspects of the categories. And as I say, we will see what those look like in depth in the second part of the session. Each of those courses is also accompanied by a course workbook. So that is giving colleagues an opportunity to sort of track their progress and reflect as they go through. Now, again, we've ensured flexibility here. So it's not a case that you need to start the course and then work through it step by step. Everything is presented in that manner, but all the videos are accessible from the moment you enter the course page. Because I'm also conscious that, for example, yourselves, a head teacher might look at that and think, well, do you know what? That's a really interesting course, but actually videos 2, 4 and 7, they're really relevant for us. I'd like to share those with the whole staff and we'll build some training around it. And that's absolutely possible to do. From the research we did at the beginning of the project, there was a sense, and this is something I've also picked up outside of Wales with other research we've been doing as well, that people are perhaps a bit dashboarded out. There's a little bit of a sort of ennui, perhaps a little bit of a frustration with some of the clunkiness, perhaps, of some of the online systems we've all been dealing with over the past few years. So we've really sought to make sure everything is as seamless and as flexible and as easily accessible as possible. Now, one thing I should just highlight at this stage, part 1 is live from today. So you'll be able to visit the website to sign up, access all the part 1 materials from today. Part 2, the courses, we're going to be rolling those out over the next 6 months. The rationale behind that is twofold. First of all, as you can imagine, there's a very significant amount of Welsh language subtitling that needs to take place, and we're currently well in the process of that. But the second point as well is we recognise there's a huge amount of material sitting within the project as a whole, and we didn't want to overwhelm people. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be releasing 6 courses at a time, so from 2 sections over the course of the next 6 months. So we'll do that in 5 stages, and we'll be communicating with you as we do that. So it'll give you an opportunity to come back to the materials, to see those courses, and sort of initially get to grips with them, the 10 areas, the part 1 materials, but then have that opportunity to then dip back in and look at those courses in depth. So that's an initial overview. Let me take you now into a little bit more detail on the rationale behind the project. And we're just going to look at 2 aspects here. The first one is, why focus on teaching and learning specifically in this manner as a way to support disadvantaged and vulnerable learners. And for me, the rationale here is really clear. We know that the most important interaction or opportunity for support we have for all learners is when we're in the classroom with them, when we have that opportunity to do our teaching to facilitate that learning. And we also know that high quality learner-centered pedagogy always leads to the best outcomes. We know that from extensive research, not least from the Education Endowment Foundation, but also from John Hattie's Visible Learning, that the quality of classroom teaching, quality of classroom teachers is the absolute driving force of outcomes. So the materials are very much intended to support colleagues, to help colleagues develop, to give them tools that they can use to achieve and facilitate that really high quality teaching and learning. But I think what we can also say here, and the research here is supportive of this, is that high quality teaching and learning is likely to have a disproportionate impact on outcomes for vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. So what we're saying here is that if we can get that teaching and learning right, if we can get it as effective as possible, we're going to have potentially, we hope, a profound impact on the educational experiences of those vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. So they're going to experience challenge, they're going to experience engagement, they're going to have their needs met, and the teacher is going to be in a position to achieve all that, to do that on a regular basis as much as possible, building on, of course, all that existing high quality practice that is already happening across the country. So that's the starting point for the rationale. We would also extend this and then say, in terms of the research base that we're using, obviously we mentioned there John Hattie's Visible Learning. I'm sure you're familiar with that as the sort of gold standard meta-analysis for what works in the classroom worldwide. We're also using the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit as a clear reference point guiding us within the materials. And again, I'm sure you're familiar. If you're not, the Education Endowment Foundation was set up at arm's length from the UK government around about 10 or 11 years ago, and it received an endowment, hence the name, so it was able to work independently from government. And the intention, which of course it's fulfilled in the subsequent years, was to provide an independent repository and base, essentially offering us a real clear guidance on what works in the classroom. The Education Endowment Foundation continues to do extensive research today, but perhaps its Teaching and Learning Toolkit, along with the various guides and reports it's released, is what it's best known for. And that Teaching and Learning Toolkit provides, again, a meta-analysis looking at different interventions in the classroom and the impact that they're likely to have on teaching and learning. So a number of the categories that we've got there: feedback, metacognition, collaborative learning, oral language interventions, although we've termed it talk, discussion and oracy, maximising the impact of teaching assistants, very closely rooted in the research materials from the Education Endowment Foundation. The other categories that we're looking at as well: differentiation, independent learning, scaffolding and modelling, assessment for learning, pupil voice, all of those areas, at least in part, connected to the Teaching and Learning Toolkit as well. And in some places, for example, the reading comprehension strategies, which is right there at the top of the toolkit, that comes through in scaffolding and modelling. But those areas also coming from a strong evidence base and areas that we know have a great impact on learners, and they're an essential feature of the day-to-day classroom teaching in which teachers engage. So that's where the project comes from, if you like. That's the sort of rationale behind its construction and also the rationale behind its research base. What I'd like to do now is just give you a little view on what the materials look like for part 1 and part 2, and then we'll have a look at the website as well and how we access the materials. So part 1 content, we said there are 2 elements to it. We've got the practical guides, and then we've also got the big picture videos that are intended to provide that stimulus, that opportunity for discussion and reflection at various levels within schools. So this is what the guides look like. You see here we've got the effective differentiation guide, and we've got the branding running all the way through. That's consistent across the piece. Obviously, we've got the color variation, but the intention is, as soon as you access the materials, as soon as anybody accesses the materials, there's this real sense that we're in the supporting vulnerable learners through teaching and learning world. You know, the little world we've created online where there's that sense of coherence, there's that sense of connection across the materials as a whole. So you'll see here we've got, in the case of differentiation, we're looking at 5 key categories of differentiation, and for each of those we've got practical strategies. So all the guides are presenting yourselves, teachers, colleagues, with a huge range of practical ideas that can be applied to the classroom. Now, one thing we've been really careful to do throughout the materials is to keep them curriculum agnostic, recognizing that, of course, there are fundamental differences between teaching in a primary context and teaching in a secondary context. So throughout the materials, the practical strategies that we're looking at, that we're elucidating, the vast majority are applicable at primary and secondary level. Of course, and this goes through all the materials, taking account of the need to make tweaks and modifications so that they are applicable to the learners with whom you are working. So what we've done throughout as well is lots of examples, lots of opportunities where we're giving examples of the strategies and techniques in a primary context and in a secondary context, and then in many cases in an A-level context as well, to show how they remain relevant, how they retain that relevance across the different age groups. Of course, I think a big part of using the materials is going to be schools and yourselves accessing them and then making those tweaks, modifications, adaptations so that they work for the individual settings, whether that's primary, secondary, and the individual needs of learners within those settings as well. You'll see running through the PowerPoint as well as on the guide there on screen, we've got a lovely set of bespoke illustrations that we've had done for those materials, and they provide a real sort of visual connection running through as well. So we've got the practical guides. We've also got the videos within part 1 as well. So you just see I've got the screen here, front screen for each of the videos. I've not got a sort of screenshot of myself there. I'll leave that for you to dip in later on today, hopefully, or in the weeks ahead when you go to the materials and have a look at them and watch some of those videos. But what we've got is 4 big picture videos for each of the sections, so 40 videos in total, where I'm presenting, unpacking those key ideas, and then at the end of each of those videos, a reflection question, really focusing in on the impact of feedback, independent learning, pupil voice, metacognition, all those different areas, focusing on that impact for our vulnerable and disadvantaged learners, and giving you that opportunity to think about those different elements of pedagogy in the context of those learners in your school, in your setting. The part 2 content then, so this is the courses, these are the multi-part courses, slightly different approach, reflecting the fact that it's a slightly different set of materials and we're doing something slightly different with them. These are all screen records. You see myself in the bottom corner there. And again, you'll see the branding, you see the color scheme running through. So we've got that absolute coherence running through all the materials. And what we've got here is for each course, we've got a sequence of videos. We've got 10 videos, a couple of courses are 9 videos just because the material demanded it. But in general, we've got 10 videos. We've got an introduction. We've got 2 activity videos. We've got a conclusion. And then we've got 6 core videos, which are all about the practical strategies and techniques that we can deploy in the classroom. And at the end of the vast majority of those videos, we've got a reflection question. And again, it's all about stimulating that reflection, that critical thinking, and also facilitating that interactivity with the materials. So it's not just a case of sitting and watching, it's very much a case of getting colleagues, getting yourselves to think about it in the context of your setting. With those part 2 materials, we also have a course workbook. So for every course, there's a course workbook which looks like this, where we capture all those reflection questions, giving colleagues an opportunity, if they wish, to capture their thinking as they go through. Now, my personal view is, if we're going to sit down, if a colleague's going to sit down and do a course from start to finish, or perhaps that could be happening as a cohort, there's no reason why you couldn't have either a whole school or a group of colleagues doing a course together. I think the course workbook is a great opportunity to capture that thinking, capture that progress as you go through, but it is optional. You don't have to do it. And that, that is a theme, as I've mentioned a couple of times, that is running through all the materials. We wanted to ensure that flexibility is there. So as I mentioned, each of the courses has 2 activities within it. And you can see here, because these are also within the course workbook, an example there is a RAG self-assessment here in the context of collaborative learning. So we have those activities there within all the courses, and they're carefully designed to give colleagues or cohorts an opportunity to really connect it to classroom experiences, to classroom teaching, and also to think forwards and think about how I'm going to take these ideas and adapt them so they work for me or they work for us. But again, it is optional. It doesn't have to be done. Some learning platforms, you have to do X before you can get to Y. We haven't done that. We wanted to ensure schools, leaders, teachers had as much flexibility as possible when using the materials, because you want to use them in the way that works for you, rather than us setting up a particular system that you have to then sort of fit yourselves into. What we wanted to do is ensure you had that absolute flexibility to tie them to your needs and your setting. So that's a quick dip into the part 1 and part 2 materials. Of course, I would really encourage you after the event later in the week to go to the website to sign up and to look at those part 1 materials in depth. So how do we do that? Where can you find the materials? Well, we have a website, and you can see we've got a screenshot from the website there. supportingvulnerablelearners.cymru. We do also have a Welsh language URL, which I'll share in just a moment. So when you land on the website, you'll see we've got two buttons there, log in and sign up. Of course, first thing you'll need to do is to go to the sign up, and that will then allow you to access all the materials. Everything is fully bilingual. If I show you the screenshot, there we go from the Welsh language version. You'll see we've got the sort of complete, the experience is completely identical, Welsh language, English language, and we have the Welsh language URL there. That will redirect you to the main page. So you hit the website, you do the sign up, and that will take you to the sign up form. And you'll see here there's just a little bit of detail that we're looking to collect from all colleagues who access the materials. All the materials are free at the point of use for every teacher in Wales for the next 2 years, and that is the funding that has covered that. In order to ensure that we only have colleagues who are teachers in Wales accessing it, when you sign up with your email address, it does need to be a hubcymru.net email address. So you'll sign up with that, put all your details in, set up a password, etc. And then we're just looking for school name and local authority, and that's really so we can just keep a record of who's accessing the materials, and we can look at the geographical spread of that. And then, for example, if there are areas where we're not getting as much access, we can look to support those areas and ask what we could do to help them to use the materials in a way that works for them. So that is the process, and that's what we'd ask you to do, and that's what we'd ask all colleagues to do. Once you've done that once, then of course you'll go to the login, and it'll be an easy ride from there. So how could the materials be used? Well, this isn't something that I'm going to address here and now, because I think actually, you know, there's a whole range of ways in which the materials could be used. And hopefully already yourselves on the call are already starting to think about that. We've got a huge range of materials, and my hope with the range of different areas of pedagogy that we're covering is that any school who's meeting the materials will immediately be thinking, that's an area that's a priority for us. That's an area that we're looking to develop. So we'll immediately see it through the lens of their current school experience, of their current teaching and learning priorities, and then we'll start to engage with the materials in that way. So I think there's a huge range of ways in which the materials can be used. And, you know, I'm excited as the project is launched to see the different ways in which schools and consortia partners, of course, as well, grab hold of the materials and start making them their own. I think, you know, I'm sort of at that point where the materials are created, we're putting them out there, and now it's very much to see how people use them and how people see them being beneficial. So that's the end of the part one of the presentation, giving that overview, where the materials come from, how they connect together, what the materials entail, what the rationale is. What I'd like to do in the second half of the presentation is now dig into those materials in a little bit more depth and give you a sort of deep dive into all the different elements, all the different aspects, and also as we go through, just pick out some key points around them, and also some of the different ideas, you know, and the sort of relevance of the different areas that we've included. So let me move us on to the second half of the presentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at each of those different areas in turn. You know, I will go through them sequentially. The one thing I would say is the sequence isn't reflective of any prioritization. It's simply we had to have some kind of sequence. That's the one on which we've settled. And again, that reflects the fact that depending your priorities, depending where you're at as a school, as an individual, consortia, I think you'll find them, you hit the materials and you'll find the things that are most relevant and timely for you. So we'll begin with feedback. And we know from the research on feedback that it has a huge impact on learner outcomes. We know that from the Education Endowment Foundation's research, where it's around +6 months compared to a sort of control group setting. We know it also from John Hattie's research. So feedback absolutely the top of the agenda in terms of the impact it can have on learner outcomes. So as I mentioned, those part one materials, we've got the 4 big picture videos, we've got the practical guide, and you can see with those big picture videos here, we're focusing on different aspects of feedback. And what I've sought to do in these videos is really, on one level, really get us back to the absolute fundamentals of the particular area of pedagogy. And I think something like feedback, that's particularly important because, of course, feedback is something that teachers are doing day in, day out. It's a big part of what's happening in the classroom. And what these videos are doing in part is giving us an opportunity to step back from that day-to-day experience we're doing, where we're teaching, we're in the run of things, and actually think critically about the nature of feedback, the fundamental basis of how feedback works, of how it allows learners to be more effective. So you see, for example, that second video, giving access to your expertise. I think sometimes that something that teachers can sometimes forget or overlook is the absolute centrality of their expertise, their expert knowledge and understanding to feedback. You know, the feedback that's provided is a function of the expertise that the teacher possesses. That's why we have qualified teachers in the first place. That's why we have teachers working in schools, because we have that expertise, that knowledge, that understanding. Partly that's curriculum knowledge, but also partly knowledge around pedagogy. In some cases, knowledge around taking exams, but also in other cases, knowledge of the specific age group with which we're working as well. So through these videos, really giving that opportunity for stimulus discussions. So it might be, for example, a school might access these videos and think, well, actually, do you know what? These would give us a really great opportunity to have some good in-depth detailed discussions about the nature of feedback. We might just use one of these videos at the start of, you know, our next sequence of CPD sessions, our twilights, for example, and we'll use those with the reflection question as a way to get the discussion going, get us thinking critically about our existing practice and where we want to move it as well. The second part then for feedback, we've got our 3 courses, and this is the sort of first view of it you're getting here, which gives you a sense of how much depth and detail there is within the multi-part courses. So we've got 30 videos across the piece here, 10 in each, and we've got our introduction in each case, really encouraging colleagues to think critically about the nature of the particular area. And then we've got a whole series of different practical strategies. Now, let me give you an example here from that first course, giving effective feedback. If we look at number 5, implementing written feedback, in that video, we've got around 5 or 6 different practical strategies that teachers can modify, adapt or tweak for use within their own classroom. So although we've got 10 videos within each of the courses, actually, if we were to count up the overall number of strategies and techniques across the piece as a whole, we're looking at hundreds upon hundreds of techniques. And there's 2 reasons for that. The first one, from my perspective, is that I always feel it's beneficial to provide a range of different practical strategies and techniques from which colleagues can select. Because I think, you know, if I think back to my own time in the classroom, there are things that would work very well for me, might not necessarily work as well for my colleague, partly because of the way we teach, partly because of our approach to teaching. So having that range and then allowing people to make that selection from within that, I think is really beneficial. I think the other thing is that we recognize that whilst we might have a particular category where we know it works, such as feedback, we know feedback works, the evidence is there, it's definitive. At the same time, there isn't a single way to make feedback work within a classroom. There are many ways in which we can take that central idea of giving feedback, learners implementing feedback, and make that effective. And it's going to vary depending on the age group, and it's going to vary depending on the area of the curriculum as well. So we're really, you know, we're really sort of taking account of that within the construction of the materials, and then in terms of the learner experience, and of course the learner being the teacher, being yourselves, whoever it is who's accessing those course materials. So as you see there, we've got the activities, activity 1 and activity 2 within each one as well, really giving that opportunity for reflection and development. So feedback is our first category. Our second category is metacognition. Again, huge research base in terms of its efficacy, right at the top of the agenda for the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit, plus 7 months progress, the most efficacious teaching and learning intervention based on the EF toolkit, and other research as well beyond that showing its centrality. For me, I think that the key around metacognition is that if learners are reflecting, refining and adapting their thinking, whether that's after the event, during the event or before the event, it's giving them that opportunity to both feel in control of their thinking, to be an active player within their learning, but it's also giving them that opportunity to refine and improve as they go, to learn from mistakes, to develop and to be actively in control of that. So to have that greater sense of agency within the classroom. So what we're then doing in our big picture videos is looking at some of those different aspects of metacognition, thinking about self-regulation, how that connects to metacognition, think about reflection, but also think about some of those strategies that we might want, that we're going to be teaching to learners, and thinking about the different ways in which we can go about that. And of course, that's then carried through into the practical guide. And I think one of the things that can be most challenging, certainly from my perspective with metacognition, is its abstractness. You know, by necessity, this is an abstract category. Thinking about thinking, you can't get much more abstract than that. So something I've really tried to do within the part 1 and part 2 materials here is focus on how we can make metacognition more concrete for ourselves as practitioners, but of course, crucially, more concrete for our learners. I think if we're considering our vulnerable and disadvantaged learners, if we can make metacognition as concrete as possible, I think it makes it that bit easier for them to both make sense of it and also to grab hold of it, to run with it and to be successful with it. So you see in our first course here, we've actually got a wonderful guidance report from the Education Endowment Foundation on metacognition. So we've gone into that in a little bit of detail within the first course. And one thing I would say at this point is, again, the courses are not intended to be done sequentially. You absolutely can. For example, a teacher might be really keen on metacognition, or a school, and they might decide we're going to start with making sense of metacognition, then we're going to do visualizing, verbalizing and narrating thinking, and then we're going to do strategies and techniques as well. And you absolutely can do the courses in that order, but you don't have to. They're also standalone. So for example, you could have a colleague or a school who are already well on their way with metacognition. So actually they don't necessarily feel they need to look at that first course, review the recommendations, they're familiar with those. So they might go straight in for that third course and use that as a tool to support professional learning. And that's true all the way through. So our second area then is metacognition, and our third area is independent learning. And as Kevin mentioned early on in the session, independent learning, not just a crucial aspect of what's happening in the classroom, but absolutely centrally connected to Curriculum for Wales and the developments that are happening at the moment. So again, we've got our 4 big picture videos here. And the first one, I think this is a really important question to ask and to think about. Why are learners not independent already? Because I think, if I think back to my own time as a teacher, I can think about times when I was working with learners, vulnerable and disadvantaged learners, in some of the settings in which I taught, and having a certain degree of frustration on my part as the teacher, feeling there's this sense, I know they have the capacity to be independent, they're not independent. What's creating that disconnect between what I feel they're capable of doing, what I know they can do, and how they're perceiving themselves? So we're really sort of drilling down in these videos and thinking about those barriers, those challenges that are preventing learners from being independent, and how we can overcome those and do so in a really practical and successful manner. And of course, that is again supported by the practical guide. So if we have a look at the part 2 materials here, we've got a series of different aspects of independent learning through which we're looking. And you'll see here in the third course there, with that course, we're focusing very much on the growth mindsets perspective and thinking about how the learner's self-perception may work against them being independent or could work in favour of them being independent. You'll also notice in that third course, we've actually only got 9 videos in that section. And there are 4 courses where we've got 9 videos rather than 10. And that simply reflects just in a few of them where the material very much demanded it. So we've got some slightly longer videos there because of the material, and just one video missed out as a consequence of that. So again, absolutely open, everything accessible. You drop onto the course pages when they become available slightly later in the year. And for example, if you're a school or school setting, or a member from one of the consortium, you think, do you know what, developing learner self-scaffolding, that is absolutely what we're thinking about at the moment. You can just drop into that second course and use that video independently should you wish. But at the same time, we might have a school or a teacher thinking, do you know what, I want to sit down, I want to do that course in full. It's absolutely where I'm at the moment. It's going to be really useful. That's absolutely doable as well. So we've got that flexibility. Okay, 4th section then, after independent learning, we've got effective differentiation. Really thinking about different ways in which we can cater to the needs of all learners. And I've done a lot of work with colleagues in Wales around effective differentiation with GWER, partner areas, Paris, other areas as well, particularly around those changes that were driven by the ALN Act and the development of the ALN co-role. So we're really coming out of that here, building out of that and thinking about mixed ability teaching and thinking about how the variety of strategies and techniques we can employ within mixed ability teaching to ensure that all learners experience challenge, have that really effective engagement in the classroom. And we're thinking about our vulnerable and disadvantaged learners and thinking actually, for them, I would certainly argue differentiation is perhaps more important than for any other group of learners. Different ways in which we can help them to access the learning, to feel confident with that learning, and to experience a really good level of challenge. So again, we've got our big picture videos there, thinking critically about differentiation, encouraging that stimulus discussion, and we've got our practical guide. And then if we go through to our courses, what I've done here is The first one, rethinking differentiation, that's really sort of taking a big picture view on differentiation and then diving down and looking at what I would describe as the 5 categories of differentiation. And you'll see those there within the course, and thinking about how we can focus on each one, or we can prioritize different ones in order to ensure that engagement across the board in a classroom and ensure that those vulnerable and disadvantaged learners are able to access the learning and experience a level of challenge that's right for them, which of course could be variable, because we know we've got vulnerable and disadvantaged learners who are incredibly academically able, some of the most gifted and talented learners. And we also know we've got some learners within that group who may have significant barriers to learning, may have additional learning needs that mean they need a great deal of extra support when they're in that context of whole class teaching. Then we've got differentiated questioning, and we're thinking there that actually questioning plays such a significant role in the classroom, in classroom discourse, that it's a really important area, certainly from my perspective, on which we can think about that personalisation. Research suggests that in a 30-year career, a teacher is going to ask approximately 1,750,000 questions. So in my view, I think it's worth spending time on as an individual category of differentiation, because there's so much opportunity there for personalisation and to tie it to learner needs. And then we've got some specific strategies and techniques around supporting those less able learners who may need that extra level of support, extra layer of scaffolding, different techniques, maybe some work around taxonomies there to really help them to access the material, to access the lesson and be successful within whole class teaching. Our 5th area is scaffolding and modelling. And of course, there's great overlap here between effective differentiation and scaffolding modelling. But we have them as 2 distinct areas, because actually there's a huge amount that we can consider in both. And my feeling was, if we combine them into one, it would mean we'd miss quite a significant amount. So you might like to think of those as 2 paired areas within the whole piece. So for scaffolding and modelling, we're thinking about the nature of scaffolding. We're thinking very much about the role of working memory and the way in which learners' working memory can be overloaded, and the role that scaffolding can play in supporting learners to overcome that, either by simplifying what learners have been asked to do or by increasing the learner's level of skill. And then we're also thinking about modelling, and we're thinking about modelling as a subset of scaffolding, but a very important one, hence why we're attending to it in specific detail. So again, we've got our big picture videos and our practical guide. And then in our part 2, we've got first video looking at scaffolding, modelling and working memory in depth and looking at that connection in some detail. Second one, prioritising here literacy scaffolding. And that plays in part to some of that EEF work around reading comprehension strategies, around oral language strategies as well, but also recognising the significant barriers that learners can face around literacy in terms of accessing the curriculum. And we're looking there, exploring different ways in which we can support learners very practically in order to overcome those barriers. And then we think about modelling in depth as well. And we're thinking in that final course about modelling a category, something that teachers are doing on a day-to-day basis. Of course they are. It's an intuitive part of the job of how we teach. But actually, as we start to delineate modelling, as we do in that course, we see that there are a lot of different elements to modelling, and actually quite a wide range of practical techniques that we can employ. So I think for me, that course particularly really encouraging, helping teachers to think about how they already model, but then thinking about the range of potential options that are open to them in terms of how they build out of that, and perhaps further develop modelling even further to really give that tailored support to learners in the classroom. Our sixth category is assessment for learning, and we have, the EEF research around assessment for learning is perhaps it suggests it's not quite as strong an intervention as the original assessment for learning research carried out by Dylan William Paul Black et al. And then built on in terms of formative assessment. However, my view on assessment for learning is that it retains its efficacy if we strip it down to its fundamentals. Certainly something I've sought to do here, and if we look at it particularly in relation to feedback. So the approach I'm taking here with assessment for learning is that we can simplify assessment for learning by considering its 3 fundamental pillars: opening up success criteria, eliciting and using information, giving formative feedback. And we go into that in some detail in the part 1 videos and in the guide, and saying actually assessment for learning doesn't need to be complex. Fundamentally, it's about effective and efficient teaching in the classroom. If we go back to the original research and see what was originally identified and what those original intentions were. So there is overlap with the feedback element here. Of course there is, but this is still, we're still seeing it as that separate category. So if we then look at the courses, again, we've made some careful decisions here about the avenues down which we've gone. In that first course, Assessment for Learning on LUT, really digging down and saying, okay, let's look at this idea of simplification. Let's make Assessment for Learning as simple to use as possible. And let's look at those 3 pillars and say, actually, if we're doing those 3 pillars, eliciting and using information, opening up success criteria, giving formative feedback, that provides us with a really sound basis for effective and efficient teaching. So for example, that first course there, I think, great for individual teachers who maybe have a bit of uncertainty or ambiguity around Assessment for Learning, or great if you're a school who is looking to, reprioritize Assessment for Learning and create that shared language through which all teachers can talk about it. So we've then gone into eliciting and using information in more depth, thinking about a variety of ways in which we can do that, and thinking about the centrality of using that information that is elicited to adapt teaching and learning so it more closely matches the needs of the learners who the teacher is working with. And then we've got questioning again. And it might be, there might be a question out there, potentially people thinking, should questioning be one of the 10 categories? And I absolutely understand that, and we did toy with that at the beginning. But what I've sought to do is address questioning, as you see, within some of the different areas. And I think personally, I think that's a method that's worked. Of course, you might disagree. You might say, Mike, we want questioning as a separate category. I'd be very, very happy to sort of discuss that with you further down the line. But nonetheless, we've got questioning in AFL there as our third course, because they are intimately linked, both in terms of eliciting information from the class, from individuals, but also potentially around feedback as well, both in terms of what the feedback is predicated on and the notion that at times we can couch feedback in the terms of questioning. Our 7th area is talk, discussion and oracy. Education Endowment Foundation would class this in their teaching and learning toolkit as oral language interventions or oral language strategies. We've given it the title talk, discussion and oracy because I think that plays in perhaps a little more readily to how we describe this in the classroom and some of the existing projects and practice that's happening across the country as well. So within the part 1 videos, we're really thinking critically about the importance of talk, discussion or oracy, about the role they can play for our vulnerable and disadvantaged learners in terms of helping them to access the curriculum to be successful, thinking there about verbal rehearsal as an absolutely key feature of effective teaching and learning. And a really nice area that we'll see also in part 2 that I really like personally as well is thinking about the different types of classroom talk. And what we're doing there is we're building on Neil Mercer's research, Neil Mercer Professor of Education, or Emeritus Professor now at the University of Cambridge, into different types of talk in the classroom. So if we look at the part 2 courses, you'll see that our second course there is very much developing in quite a lot of detail Mercer's ideas around 3 types of classroom talk: disputational talk, cumulative talk and exploratory talk. We're not saying these are the only types of talk that might happen in the classroom, but we are saying these are 3 really useful ideas that we can attend to when we're thinking about talk, discussion and oracy in the context of teaching and learning. And as you'll see, if you dip into that course in detail, Mercer, and I would agree with him here, would say exploratory talk is that type of talk we want to prioritize, that is critical but respectful, where we're all sort of working together, driving towards that increase in knowledge and deepening of understanding. But there's also really important places for disputational and cumulative talk as ways in which to help learners discuss and to develop their skills around oracy. We're also thinking about why discussion matters in the classroom, and then planning and delivering effective discussion. And in those 2 courses as well, we're thinking about the importance of structure. And this ties in to some extent as well to the Education Endowment Foundation's research on collaborative learning, which we'll come back to in part 9 as well, about the absolute importance of structure within collaborative learning activities. Now, of course, a huge amount of the talk, discussion and oracy we do in the classroom is going to be collaborative in nature between learners. Some of it will be teacher to learner as well. So really emphasizing the importance of structure there as a tool to drive learner engagement and to drive those positive outcomes. Our 8th area is maximizing the impact of teaching assistants. Now, the Education Endowment Foundation has produced quite a bit of research and guidance around this. And in their guidance report, Maximising the Impact of TAs, they look at a whole series of key recommendations that schools can look to look to employ in order to increase the impact that TAs are having on teaching and learning and on learners. So what we do in this particular section is we look at that research, look at that guidance in quite a lot of detail actually, and really sort of unpicking it and thinking about what that means from a senior leadership perspective in terms of how TAs are deployed in school, and what it also means in a classroom perspective in terms of how TAs are liaising with and working with teachers, and also what it means in the context of structured interventions, which is a very common way in which TAs are deployed in schools to deliver those interventions outside of the classroom setting. So you can see that's carried through there in the videos, and then we've also got the practical guide and the scaffolding ladder. You might see that there. We do touch on that in scaffolding and modelling as well. Really wonderful technique developed by 3 researchers, Boston, K, Radford and Webster, who were integral to that EEF work on maximising the impact of TAs. Really nice tool that we can encourage TAs to use so that they're prioritising learning rather than task completion. If we have a look at the courses here, this is the first place where we've got a slight distinction actually between the audience of the courses. Prior to this point, and indeed after this point, the courses are intended both for leaders and for teachers. Anyone can dip into them, anyone can access them, and they're going to be relevant. Here we've got a distinction. That first course, Developing the Impact of Teaching Assistants, that one is absolutely aimed at senior and middle leaders. And you see there, we go into the EF recommendations in a lot of detail. We think about what they mean, what their implications are for staffing, for deployment of TAs, for some issues around contracts and time as well, and TAs working inside and outside the classroom. And we look at practical strategies to facilitate really good outcomes. The second 2 courses, they are actually specifically aimed at teaching assistants. So we've got teaching and learning tools for teaching assistants and positive behaviour management for teaching assistants. Now, one of the recommendations in the Education Endowment Foundation's research report, in their guidance, is to upskill teaching assistants, is to provide them with supportive training. So what we thought we'd do here is actually help schools to meet that recommendation if this is an area that they're looking at. So when the courses become available a little further in the year, what you've actually got here is 2 really nicely constructed courses, which when we put them together, when I presented them, they're talking directly to teaching assistants. So you'll see there within the Teaching and Learning Tools course, we've got key aspects that do crop up in other areas of the suite of materials, but we're looking at them here very much from that perspective of the teaching assistant, supplementing what the teacher is doing, working with learners either one-to-one or in a small group setting. And similarly with the positive behaviour management there, we're thinking about it from that teaching assistant's perspective, the kind of challenges they might be encountering, how they might be having to manage behaviour or looking to manage behaviour when they're working with learners one-on-one or in a small group setting. So, very conscious decision again here in terms of the construction of the materials to try and provide schools, settings, consortia, colleagues with the most effective set of courses possible. So we've got the first one, senior and middle leaders, really thinking about deployment of teaching assistants, thinking about the EEF guidance, and then we've got the second and third courses specifically aimed at teaching assistants to really give schools that support, that sort of booster, if you like, to if you're looking to develop the impact of TAs, to do that very quickly, very effectively by getting TAs involved with those learning materials. Our 9th area then, which I mentioned just briefly previously, is collaborative learning. This comes out at +5 months in the Education Endowment Foundation's Teaching and Learning Toolkit. The evidence strength here isn't as strong in the toolkit as it is for feedback metacognition, oral language interventions, reading comprehension strategies, some of the other areas. However, I think we'd all agree that collaborative learning is an essential feature of many classrooms, if not all classrooms. And one thing that is really emphasised within the EEF's research and the toolkit information around collaborative learning is the importance of structure, and the the evidence pointing in the direction that structured collaborative learning is far more effective than unstructured, and that is disproportionately the case in terms of the impact for vulnerable and disadvantaged learners. So one of the things we're really looking at throughout all these collaborative learning materials, part 1 and part 2, is how we can structure collaborative learning and the different ways we can do that. I'm really thinking in sort of 2 directions here about, on the one hand, some quite simple ways in which we can structure collaborative learning that don't necessarily require a huge amount of planning or development, but also then some more expansive ways in terms of specific activity structures that we can use that provide, sort of coherent drive, if you like, through the collaborative learning that then allow learners to, retain engagement, but also retain purpose and direction and targeting effort throughout the collaborative learning. If it is an activity that's going to extend out to sort of 20, 30 minutes or potentially even beyond. So we look at that in detail within the part 1, and you'll see they're teaching learners to work collaborative. We also think about those soft skills, and I think that soft skill element, sometimes also called skills for life, or various different descriptors there. I think that comes out, perhaps for me anyway, most evidently within the context of collaborative learning, because we have that social and emotional element coming in there, and that sense that learners are not only learning the content, but they're also learning how to work with other people and how to do that successfully. Something, of course, we as adults take for granted to do in our daily lives, all the time. So if we have a look at the part 2 materials here, the courses, you'll see within all of them, we're very much carrying through that idea of structure, of the centrality of structure and the different ways in which we can approach that. So we've got our practical approaches to collaborative learning, and we're thinking there, about activity planning, about the importance of, in the planning stage, thinking about how that collaborative learning is going to run, how we can channel and target learner effort most effectively, and looking at lots of different ways in which we can do that. Then we've got maximizing the impact of collaborative learning, and what I've done there in the first videos 2 and 3 focus in on some of those common problems that not always, but often might arise within the context of collaborative learning, many of which are a function of that social and emotional element that we don't necessarily get with other types of teaching and learning interventions or other types of planning that we might do. But of course, we've also got the solutions there, and that's something which is across the course as a whole. Any kind of problem that we're looking at or any challenge, always giving solutions, always giving practical techniques that colleagues can take, adapt, modify, and use in their own settings. And then that third one there, innovative approaches to collaborative learning, really thinking about the scope within collaborative learning to be creative, to be original, maybe to push the boundaries a little bit in terms of pedagogy and to try new things. We've got some really lovely, different, quite unusual activity structures in there that we're looking at. So collaborative learning structure is absolutely central here, and we're emphasizing that all the way through. Our final area then is pupil voice, and this one stands, I wouldn't say it doesn't stand alone, but it's subtly different, if you like, to what's preceded it, in the sense that we are very much focused on teaching and learning here, but in those other 9 areas that we've looked at, we're thinking predominantly about the teacher's role in teaching and learning in terms of the planning and the teaching phase. Of course, also in number 8, the teaching assistant as well. And we're also thinking about it in that big picture sense from the perspective of senior leadership and driving developments in teaching and learning. Whereas here in our 10th and final section, we're thinking about the pupil's perspective, and we're thinking about pupil voice here, and we're thinking about how we can gain access to pupil voice, give learners agency, make them feel part of the process of teaching and learning. And I think there's sort of 2 strands that come off that. The first one is thinking about how that benefits learners and how that makes learners feel a part of teaching and learning, feel engaged with it, feel that their voice is heard and recognised. And I think that's particularly influential for vulnerable and disadvantaged learners who, for various reasons, may feel that they have less agency, perhaps, than some of their peers. But we're also thinking, of course, about the huge benefits it brings to us as teachers and to schools as a whole in terms of gaining access to pupils' experiences and using that information then to adapt teaching and learning and what's happening in the classroom and more widely as well. So again, we've got our big picture videos, reflecting, stimulus, thinking about pupil voice, thinking about what's happening already, your existing practice in schools, and also some strategies, and then that complemented there by the practical guide. And then in part 2 in our courses, we're thinking, first of all, why does pupil voice matter? So if there's that question perhaps in school, or perhaps question from colleagues about whether pupil voice should be prioritised, I think that's a great course to do with colleagues, or to encourage them to take part in, to really think about the huge benefits that pupil voice can bring both to learners and to teachers. And then we've got pupil voice at a classroom level and at a whole school level. So recognising that there are subtle differences there in the approaches that we might be taking. I'm thinking very much that pupil voice at a classroom level, we might have an individual teacher perhaps, a lights on the materials, wants to look at that in order to drive their work in the classroom. But then also we might be thinking from a senior middle leadership perspective, what can we do on a whole school level? And then that third course aimed at that slightly different audience in order to take account of the different elements that we might prioritize depending on whether we're looking whole school or looking at a classroom level. With that said, there is of course overlap between those two, because if we are looking to embed pupil voice across the school as a whole, a part of that is going to be encouraging colleagues to be doing things at a classroom level. You see some of those examples within the course elements there that are going to help them access learner voice and help them understand the experiences that learners are having, their opinions and their ideas and so forth. So that, ladies and gents, takes you through the materials in a little bit of depth. Couple of points just to note, just to remind you of before I move to questions. And Darren, thank you very much for sending those through to me, those questions that have gone into the Q&A. The first one is, as I said, from today, Supporting Vulnerable Learners is live. All the Part 1 materials are accessible. All you need to do is visit the website and sign up and then log in. The Part 2 materials that we've been looking at, these courses, we will be rolling those out over the next 6 months. We'll be doing 2 sets at a time. So hopefully sort of end of Feb, March sort of time, we're going to have those first 2 sets, our feedback and metacognition. Then we'll have the next 2, and so on. So we'll keep you informed about that. There'll be communication coming down, and that'll give you a chance to, make sense of the materials, because there is a lot, and it is very much about, and as Arwin mentioned earlier on, and Kevin as well, about thinking, how are these going to work for us? Where are we situating these? What do we want to prioritize? What marries up with where we're at currently? So we're not going to overload you, as it were. And then there'll be that opportunity to continue returning to the materials and exploring those new materials as we progress through the next few months. So let me get the final slide up for you as I move to answer a couple of questions. Where can you find the materials? Quick reminder for you, we've got the website there. You can head over there, you can have a look, you can sign up today. Okay. Thank you very much, ladies and gents. I appreciate your time and energy to listening to that. I've got a question that's come through. One question regarding special schools. Has there been a focus on ALN in these resources? Was there any representation from them whilst designing this programme? So one thing I would say, initially I would say to that, from my perspective, I think the materials absolutely are relevant and usable and appropriate for colleagues working in special schools. Not every single element is going to be directly relevant to every special school, of course, but I think there's a huge amount within the materials that special schools will be able to use and which they'll find relevant. And I would also go back to that earlier point about schools being able to modify, adapt different elements of the materials and the strategies so they work in your particular setting. Has there been a focus on ALN in these resources? Well, there hasn't been an explicit ALN focus. If you like, our focus has been on supporting vulnerable and disadvantaged learners and thinking about what works in the classroom. We also know that the things that work, the research suggests they tend to work for all learners, with the caveat, of course, that the way in which those strategies or those pedagogical elements are deployed is going to vary depending on the learners with whom you're working. So there hasn't been an explicit focus on ALN learners, but we do recognise that learners who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, very often they might be ALN learners, or they might have additional learning needs. And there's certainly, in my view, a lot within the materials, particularly in differentiation, particularly in scaffolding modelling, potentially as well in maximising the impact of TAs if deployment around TAs does see those TAs working with learners who have additional learning needs, and some of the other categories as well. I think there's an awful lot there that is directly relevant and speaks directly to the experience of ALN learners, not just within whole class teaching in mainstream settings, but also in special schools as well. So I hope that's answered that question in sufficient detail. Any other questions coming through? I'd be very happy to answer those. But I think what I'll do is, Darren, I'll come out of my share now, and we can just see if there are any further of those, or if we're going to wrap things up.
No further questions, Mike. It was just around eligibility and access requests. So we've dealt with them privately in the chat.
Super. Thank you so much. Thank you. Well, I'd just like to conclude by passing over to Arwin, who I believe is going to say a few words. And just before I do that, I'd just like to say, again, huge thanks to everybody involved with the project, for all the people who supported it. And, huge thanks to everybody who's joined us today. And I'm really excited about the project launching. I'm really excited to hear from yourselves, from schools, from consortia, from colleagues across the country about how they're using it, what they think, and any questions, any thoughts, obviously come to me, or speak to me, or via the consortium, or via whoever it is, get back to me, and we'll have those conversations. So thank you very much, ladies and gents, and all the best with using the materials.
Gai diolch o galon, Mike, am y cyflwyniad yn y bore yma a gosod yr adnodd gwerthfawr yma yn ei gyd-destun. A very, very warm thank you, Mike, for the clarity that you brought into explaining what the content of this, what I think is going to be an extremely valuable resource to support vulnerable and disadvantaged learner. And I think the point that you've emphasised all the way along, that we might identify some learners as being disadvantaged and being vulnerable, but they also cover the range of ability range as well. And I think that is, in your response to the special school context, I think that is equally pertinent, especially in those areas that you touched there as well. So what we've got really here is a and 10 parts with, 3 parts basically to each. We've got 30 modules. That's, I think, is going to be a very rich vein of professional learning. I think not only for people in schools, but also for ourselves in reflecting on this incredibly important area. And I would also say that there's an opportunity for personal reflection. We can dip into the resources, see and identify, and reflect on our own strengths and areas that we want to deliver. We can go there in mini teams, we can go in large teams, departments, and we can also go there at a whole school level. But I think what's important is this is an opportunity to have a discussion, pause, reflect, and really deepen teaching and learning, especially for this particular group that we've been discussing this morning. But I think as well, because of the quality of the materials, I think they're equally pertinent for all learners in every classrooms, and the evidence base behind the techniques that are being introduced and investigated will allow all of us to be reflective practitioners as we look to improve on the quality of offer and provision that we give to our learners, improve the curriculum, as Kevin touched upon earlier, make it more pertinent, making it more local, and ensuring that the 4 purposes that we are on that journey to ensure that the learners get that rounded experience around the 4 purposes. The link is in the chat, which is available. And Mike made it very clear, through your hub address you will have access especially to part 1, and we're looking forward then to the sharing of these resources as they come off, if you like, this particular conveyor belt, to allow us to do this reflection. And finally, I think, just to draw things to a close, I would really thank Helen Richards and the group that you worked with originally to coordinate all this work, and the work across the regions to make this actually happen in partnership with Mike. Really grateful for the support of Welsh Government, particularly Owen Lloyd and Dr. Kevin Palmer, who supported and helped sponsor this particular resource. And finally, I think, well, thanks to Mike Gershin, who I think this tool will be incredibly valuable for all of us reflecting on practice, and those of you who have been through inspection or who are looking at inspection closely, and you know this is far wider than inspection. This is a particular area of focus that testing inspectors are really concentrating on in this, as Kevin touched on, and I think we might call it post-COVID, or hopefully call it post-COVID, as we are reflecting on the needs of the range of learners that we are teaching, and that we are then refining and mirroring our teaching to make sure that the learners under our responsibility have the greatest support in their learning. So looking forward, as Mike was saying, to develop this resource with you, to work alongside, to train alongside, and ensure that the focus or the provision in the classroom then, from the menu offered by the curriculum to the teachers doing the delivery, that these techniques will be invaluable to ensure that the learners get the very best opportunities in our schools. Felly diolch yn fawr iawn I bawb sydd wedi bod yn gwrando bore yma ac wedi bod yn cymeryd rhan a dymuno'n dda I chi wrth ddefnyddio'r adnodd yma wrth ni fynd yn y blaenau. Many thanks for everybody who's participated this morning and has been part of not only the preparation for the presentation, but also who've been in the audience this morning, and wishing you all the very best in using this incredibly valuable resource as we go forward. Diolch yn fawr.